tonight, we ask a question the Vatican never wanted spoken aloud. Why did Rome fear an ancient Egyptian scribe more than the devil himself? For centuries, Satan has been the perfect adversary, a figure that could be bound by ritual, exorcised by prayer, contained within the walls of doctrine. But Thoth was different. He was not temptation. He was transmission, from lost temples in Egypt to the burning of the Library of Alexandria, from hidden manuscripts in monasteries to coded diagrams in Renaissance cathedrals. His presence survived, not as myth, but as method. Thoth offered a mirror, a way to understand, to verify, to weigh truth within. And that was far more dangerous than any demon, because while the devil could be conquered by priests, Thoth taught that priests were no longer required. Deep inside, Vatican vaults lie the redactions, the forbidden texts, the deliberate silences. They reveal a fear not of evil, but of knowledge, a fear that one day the faithful might realize they could read the universe for themselves. So before you dismiss this as legend, ask yourself, what power is more threatening? A devil who tempts, or a scribe who teaches? Like the video, subscribe. Because tonight, we open the book Rome tried hardest to close. And some truths were feared not because they destroy faith, but because they make it unnecessary. Deep in the heart of the Vatican lies a silence thicker than any cathedral wall, a silence that hums with secrets older than Rome itself. Imagine walking down a corridor lined with shelves that stretch further than your eyes can follow, each one stacked with manuscripts, scrolls, and letters that chart the rise and fall of civilizations. The air smells of old paper and stone dust, of centuries pressed into ink. It is here, in these hidden vaults, that you begin to realize something unsettling. Among the countless forbidden texts guarded under lock and key, the Vatican feared one name more than Satan himself, Thoth. To most, the devil is the obvious enemy, the red figure with horns, the embodiment of temptation and rebellion, the adversary of heaven. He can be fought with prayers, silenced with exorcisms, defeated by saints wielding the sign of the cross. He is dangerous but predictable. His methods are known. His tricks have been catalogued for centuries. But Thoth was different. He was not a demon whispering sins. He was a teacher whispering truths, and that was something the church could not afford. Thoth was the god of scribes, the keeper of words, the measurer of wisdom in the halls of Egypt. He carried no pitchfork. He burned no cities. Instead, he held a pen, a scroll, a balance. His power was not destruction, but instruction. To the church, that made him far more threatening. Because a devil can frighten the faithful into obedience, but a teacher can free them from needing obedience at all. A devil thrives in shadow. Thoth offered light, and light exposes. Picture the Vatican in the late Middle Ages. Popes wrapped in velvet robes, candles flickering in golden candelabras, scholars labouring over scripture, each word weighed like jewels. Control was fragile, yet absolute. The Church's authority relied on being the sole guardian of sacred truth. Only priests could read the Bible. Only bishops could interpret. Only Rome could declare what was heresy and what was holy. But what if someone discovered there were other texts, older texts, whispering that knowledge could be direct, personal, not filtered through the hierarchy? That was the danger Thoth represented. The writings linked to him, later called Hermetica, did not tell people to fear hellfire or beg for salvation. They told them to look within, to see the divine spark inside their own mind. They suggested that the universe was not a prison ruled by sin, but a pattern that could be studied, decoded, and even shaped. Imagine how explosive that would be in a world where peasants bowed to priests for every scrap of guidance. If people believed they could reach God by themselves, why would they need confession? Why would they need Rome? So the Church did what it always did when faced with a dangerous idea. It hid it. Some texts were buried in archives, Others were declared forbidden. Still others were quietly destroyed. But the shadow of Thoth lingered, carried through whispers, symbols, and secret societies. The fear was not that he was false, but that he was too true. The devil promised chaos, but chaos can be managed. Thoth promised knowledge, and knowledge could unbuild the entire system from within. This is why, in the deepest vaults, the guardians of Rome trembled not at horns or fire, but at ink and parchment, not at Satan, but at the scribe who weighed hearts with a pen. Names are more than words. They are vessels, disguises, signals passed through time. When you trace the story of Thoth, you quickly find yourself caught in a current of shifting titles that seem to change shape every time a culture touches them. In Egypt, he was Jehuti, the ibis-headed scribe who measured the weight of truth against the feather of Mart. In Greece, he became Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great, a sage whose wisdom was said to bridge heaven, earth, and the underworld. To the Romans, he was simply Hermes, a messenger, a god of knowledge and transition. Each mask was different, but beneath the surface, the current was the same, a current of forbidden knowledge. Think about it. When a name travels, it often sheds one meaning and picks up another. Jehuti was a figure rooted in temples and tombs, a divine accountant who recorded the fate of souls. But when the Greeks encountered Egypt, they did what conquerors often do. They translated the gods into their own language, merging and reshaping. Jehuti became Hermes, but not the playful trickster known from myths of Olympus. This Hermes was magnified, exalted, the Hermes Trismegistus, who carried teachings that felt less like myth and more like coded philosophy. The texts attributed to him, later called the Hermetica, read like conversations between a teacher and a disciple. They speak of the cosmos as alive, of creation as a mirror of the mind, of God as both infinite and intimate. For a Greek audience, this was strange and alluring. For a Roman audience, it was suspicious. And for the church that would rise centuries later, it was intolerable, because these words did not bow to one creed or one institution. They carried the fingerprints of Egypt, Greece, and Rome, and yet belonged to none of them. They were slippery, unclaimed, uncontrollable. Names became a cloak. By calling the writings Hermetic rather than Egyptian, later thinkers could keep the knowledge alive under safer packaging. By linking Hermes to the idea of ancient wisdom, philosophers of the Renaissance could study these texts while pretending they were simply rediscovering the roots of Christian truth. The Church, however, recognized the danger. It knew that even under new names, the current flowing from Thoth still pulsed with independence. It whispered that truth did not belong to bishops or popes. It whispered that the universe could be understood through correspondence, through observation, through the human mind itself. And that is the trick of names. They disguise while they preserve. They let dangerous ideas survive across centuries and empires. If Jehuti had remained only Egyptian, his legacy might have died with the temples. But as Hermes Trismegistus, he slipped into Greek manuscripts, into Arabic translations, into Latin copies kept in monastic libraries. Every time the church tried to erase one mask, another appeared. And so the current of Thoth's teaching never truly stopped. It only changed language. To follow this story is to follow the stream of names like stepping stones across history. Jehuti, Hermes, Trismegistus, each one carrying the same forbidden message. Knowledge belongs to all who seek it, not just to those who guard it. And that is what Rome feared most. Not the devil in disguise, but the scribe who could never quite be erased because his name was always waiting in another tongue. Every institution has a fear it cannot name out loud. For Rome it was not lust, though countless priests fell into it. It was not power, though kingdoms were built and broken over papal commands. The true sin, the one never spoken, was certainty. Not the certainty of dogma, but the certainty that comes when a person discovers truth on their own, without a priest to translate it. This was the crack in the wall, the one thing the church could never confess, because to confess it would be to surrender the foundation of its power. Imagine the medieval world. A villager walks into a church and stares at stained glass glowing in the morning light. The Bible is read aloud in Latin, a language he does not understand. Every answer to life and death is filtered through the priest at the pulpit. The villager cannot read the book, cannot question the meaning, cannot test the words. Rome presents itself as the sole gatekeeper of revelation. Authority rests not on whether the teaching makes sense, but on who delivers it. Revelation by authority. That was the heartbeat of the church. But the Hermetic writings, tied to Thoth, whispered something else. They said the divine spark was inside every person, waiting to be remembered. They said creation was a mirror, and that the mind could climb the ladder of heaven by its own effort, not through indulgences or rituals purchased from a priest. They suggested that truth was not revealed by decree, but realized by experience. Imagine the danger of that idea. If a peasant believed he could touch God by meditating under the night sky, or by tracing patterns in the stars, what role did the priest serve? If a scholar found divine logic in geometry, or in the way plants grew, why seek papal approval? This was not rebellion, it was independence, and independence was deadly to centralized control. Certainty was the unspoken threat. A man who sins can be corrected, punished, or forgiven. A man who questions can be silenced. But a man who knows, a man who has touched something true for himself, cannot be unknowing. That kind of certainty cannot be excommunicated. It spreads like fire. And once it spreads, Rome no longer controls the flame. This was the fear hidden in councils and inquisitions, the reason Hermetic and Gnostic ideas were not merely debated but crushed. The Church created a story where Satan tempted and Christ saved, where obedience was the path to heaven. But what if a person found that salvation was already alive inside them, without mediation, without permission? That was the sin Rome could not confess. It was not about rejecting God, but about bypassing Rome. It was about knowledge that freed people from needing the institution at all. So the battle lines were drawn not between good and evil, but between two ways of knowing. Revelation through authority, or realization through experience. Rome could never admit that second path existed. To do so would be to unravel its own throne. And yet the whisper of certainty remained, carried in hidden texts, passed hand to hand, a secret sin the Church could never cleanse. There are moments in history when a single line of text carries enough weight to shake kingdoms. The Emerald Tablet is one of those moments. Its words are deceptively simple. As above, so below. As within, so without. A two-line cosmology, but behind it a fuse that could unravel centuries of priestly control. Because hidden inside that phrase is a vision of the universe that does not require intermediaries, no pulpits, no altars, no walls of Latin between God and man. It places creation not in the hands of a distant hierarchy, but inside the seeker themselves. The origins of the Emerald Tablet are wrapped in shadow. Some say it was written by Thoth in the earliest days of Egypt, etched into green stone and hidden in a temple. Others say it surfaced in Alexandria centuries later, translated by alchemists who whispered its verses as if passing a secret spell. Wherever it came from, the tablet spread like an underground current, picked up by Arabs during the rise of Islam, carried into Spain, and eventually copied into the Latin world during the Middle Ages. The words were short enough to memorize, light enough to carry, powerful enough to terrify. Think about the claim, as above, so below. It means that the heavens and the earth reflect one another, that the same laws governing the stars move within the human heart, that by studying yourself you can understand the cosmos, and by studying the cosmos you can understand yourself. Suddenly, knowledge is no longer something only priests can bestow. It is not bound to churches or rituals. it becomes portable, personal, alive. Anyone who dares to look inward or upward can find the same truths Rome claimed to own. This is why the tablet was so disruptive. The Church's entire authority rested on monopoly. It stood as the bridge between mortal and divine. Break that monopoly and the bridge collapses. The Emerald Tablet did not just question dogma, it ignored it completely. It offered a map that belonged to no one and everyone at the same time. That terrified Rome more than any heretic sermon, because you can burn a man but not a metaphor. For alchemists, the phrase meant that the work of transforming metals was also the work of transforming the soul. For philosophers, it meant that the universe was patterned, knowable, mirrored in every scale. For mystics, it meant that God was not locked behind stone walls, but present in breath, thought, and vision. In every interpretation, the message was the same. You already carry the key. You are already the temple. Picture a monk in the 13th century, hunched over a manuscript, copying these forbidden words by candlelight. He knows that if discovered he could be branded a heretic, exiled, or worse. Yet he writes them anyway, because something in them feels truer than anything proclaimed from the pulpit. That is the danger of the Emerald Tablet. It does not argue, it declares. It does not preach obedience, it invites discovery. As above, so below. It is both riddle and revelation. And in those words lies the quiet rebellion of knowledge that belongs not to priests but to seekers. A line so simple it could fit in the mouth of a child, and yet so dangerous it could topple empires. Lay two books on a table. On one side rests the Holy Scripture, the Bible compiled over centuries, canonized by councils, guarded fiercely by the Church. On the other side sits the Hermetica, those strange texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, born of Egypt but reshaped in Greek and Latin. At first glance, they could not be more different. One, the foundation of Western faith, the other, a patchwork of mystical dialogues. Yet when you read them side by side, the tension is undeniable. The Bible insists salvation comes through Christ, mediated by the Church. The Hermetica whispers that salvation comes through knowledge, gnosis, realized within the seeker directly. And in that contrast lies the danger. The Scriptures are structured like a ladder guarded by priests. To climb, you must follow the sacraments, the commandments, the interpretations passed down through bishops and councils. Every rung is mediated, every ascent controlled. The Hermetica, however, offer something wild and untamed. They describe conversations between a teacher and a student, but the teacher is not a priest. He is the voice of divine reason itself, the nous, speaking inside the disciple's mind. Salvation in these texts is not purchased or performed, it is awakened, a remembrance of what the soul already is. Imagine the implications. The Bible tells a farmer in the 13th century that he must confess to a priest, receive absolution, and pay his tithes. The Hermetica would tell that same farmer to look at the rising sun and recognize that the light outside is the same as the light within. One path reinforces hierarchy, the other dissolves it. One makes you dependent, the other makes you free. Rome understood this clash very well. It was not afraid of stories about Egyptian gods or Greek sages. It was afraid of the method. The Hermetica trained people to think differently. Instead of waiting for revelation from the pulpit, they encouraged seekers to turn inward, to test, to contemplate. Revelation by authority became unnecessary when realization by experience was available. This was not heresy in the usual sense. It was bypass. It was a detour around the entire structure of the Church. The Church labelled the Hermetica dangerous and suspicious, but still copies survived. Renaissance scholars would later translate them with reverence, believing they were as old as Moses, perhaps even older. For a moment, Europe trembled with the idea that Christianity was not the only container of divine truth, that there were parallel rivers flowing from Egypt, Greece, and beyond. To the faithful, this was exhilarating. To Rome, it was catastrophic. Picture the contrast one last time. the Corpus Christianum, the body of the Church, built on obedience, confession, authority. The Corpus Hermeticum, the body of Hermes, built on reflection, correspondence, awakening. Two bodies locked in silent opposition, Scripture against Scripture. And for those who dared to read both, the truth became clear. Salvation does not always descend from above. Sometimes it rises quietly from within. That was the heresy Rome feared most. In the ancient halls of the Egyptian afterlife, there is a room where no priest holds power, no king rules, and no sword enforces law. This is the Hall of Ma'at, where Thoth, the ibis-headed scribe, waits patiently. Here, the heart of every soul is weighed against a single feather, the symbol of truth. There are no judgments passed lightly, no mercy granted by decree. The scales do not lie, they measure. Every thought, every action, every hidden intention is considered, and the soul is either light enough to pass or heavy enough to be consumed. In this simple act, the cosmic librarian embodies something far more terrifying than temptation or sin. Rome feared Thoth not because he whispered promises or threats, but because he demanded accountability. Unlike Satan, who tempts and deceives, Thoth records and witnesses. He does not seduce, he observes. He does not manipulate, he catalogues. Every truth is written, every lie noted. In the eyes of the Church, a being who holds truth as a ledger is a revolutionary. A devil can be resisted, banished, or defeated. A scribe, especially one immortal and omniscient, cannot. Imagine the implications. A person could kneel before a priest, confess sins, receive absolution. Yet the scribe would know the unspoken transgressions, the thoughts never uttered. There is no hiding, no loophole, no ritual to erase the record. Truth is impartial, unchanging, and fatal to false authority. A church that builds its power on interpretation, discretion, and selective knowledge suddenly faces an idea that threatens its very foundation. If Thoth is real, if the scales are absolute, then the hierarchies of heaven and earth are meaningless. Thoth's danger grows because he bridges worlds. He is not bound to Egypt, not limited by scripture. He moves through myth, memory, and symbol. He appears as Jehuti, Hermes Trismegistus, the wise counselor, and always the recorder. His presence in any tradition means that knowledge is no longer secret. Knowledge is visible, accountable, and active. The scribe does not forgive, he informs. Every lie, every manipulation, every sanctioned sin is potentially exposed. In the Renaissance, scholars glimpsed this power and were captivated. The Hermetic texts, attributed to Hermes, teach correspondences between heaven and earth, body and soul. To understand them is to understand that the universe itself keeps records, that cosmic law is impartial, and that no human hierarchy can claim absolute authority over truth. This is why Thoth is dangerous. Not because he punishes, but because he reminds. He reminds every reader, every student, every seeker, that the world is not what rulers say it is what it is. Rome's fear was subtle, but profound. Temptation can be countered with ritual. Power can be challenged with politics. But a witness, a scribe, an eternal librarian, cannot be silenced. He does not corrupt, he exposes. And for a church that relies on controlled narratives, Thoth represents not a devil to be exorcised, but a truth that cannot be tamed. The scribe who weighs hearts is the ultimate threat because he makes honesty inevitable and authority optional. In that quiet measure, in that still observation, lies a danger far greater than any fire or brimstone. In the city of Alexandria, the sun would rise over the harbour and catch the marble of the great library, glinting like knowledge itself had been cast in stone. The library was not just shelves and scrolls. It was a pulse, a heartbeat of human curiosity. Scholars from across the Mediterranean came to study, to copy, to debate. It contained works older than any living memory, texts from Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, and beyond. Among these scrolls, the words attributed to Thoth, the eternal scribe, were treasured, whispered, and feared. They were dangerous because they carried something Rome could never fully control, a direct line to knowledge unmediated by church or king. And then the fire came. Centuries of careful preservation succumbed to smoke and flame. Some say it was accidental, others claim political maneuvering. Whatever the cause, the library's destruction scattered texts, burned scrolls, and scattered the seeds of knowledge far beyond Alexandria. Scholars fled with what they could carry, hiding manuscripts beneath cloaks, smuggling fragments across seas, and entrusting the wisdom of Thoth to those who would translate it into Greek first. From Alexandria, the corpus of Thoth became a migrating river, flowing into new cultures, languages, and hands. In Greek, the Hermetic texts found a new life. Philosophers like Hermes Trismegistus were written about, quoted, and debated. The texts carried the same core, the same insistence on direct experience and the primacy of knowledge, but now framed in a culture that valued logic, inquiry, and the human mind as a vessel for understanding the divine. The words adapted to the letters and grammar of a new tongue, but their essence, the teaching that knowledge itself was sacred, remained intact. From Greek, the texts travelled again, this time to the courts and libraries of the Arabic world. Scholars in Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba preserved what the flames had not consumed. They translated scrolls into Arabic script, commenting, annotating, and expanding on them. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and alchemy were all intertwined with the Hermetic wisdom. Once again, the corpus adapted, proving resilient. It became something more than just words. It became a living, breathing current of thought, moving silently beneath the surface of empires and religions. Finally, in the 12th and 13th centuries, the Hermetic texts returned to Europe in Latin translations. Crusaders, traders, and scholars brought fragments to Italian city-states, monasteries, and universities. The Vatican and other church authorities noticed the influx, wary of a knowledge that bypassed their control. Thoth's teachings were no longer bound to the Nile or the Mediterranean. They were in the hearts and hands of those who could read, understand, and share them. Fire destroyed walls, but could not destroy ideas. The corpus of Thoth had learned to migrate, to adapt, to survive. Every translation, every movement, every hidden manuscript carried the weight of a scribe who measured hearts, a scribe who preserved truth, and a truth that no empire, no pope, no fire could ever fully extinguish. The flame in Alexandria was not the end. It was the beginning of a journey, one that would eventually reach the halls of Europe, whispering secrets to those bold enough to listen. In the dimly lit scriptoriums of Europe, the air smelled of ink, dust, and candle wax. Monks hunched over wooden desks, quills scratching against vellum as they copied manuscripts for centuries. These were not just books, they were lifelines to knowledge older than Europe itself. Among the religious psalms, chronicles, and treatises, fragments of Hermetic texts appeared like hidden veins of gold. A monk might stumble across a phrase in Latin or Greek that spoke of the cosmos, of human souls reflecting the stars, of the body as a temple of divine law. And then, in the margins, something even more daring would appear. A diagram, a circle with intersecting lines, a star with 7 points, a small notation in code. These were not doodles, they were maps of understanding, cryptic guides to gnosis, the kind of knowledge that threatened authority because it did not rely on the priesthood to interpret. Each marginal note was a risk, a rebellion written in silence. Some monks copied the texts with trembling hands, fearful that the Inquisition or inquisitive abbots might see the power these diagrams held. They knew that knowledge was dangerous, more dangerous than heresy or blasphemy, because it bypassed the structures of control Rome had built over centuries. It wasn't only fear that guided the monks. It was reverence. The diagrams were sacred. They reflected the logic of the cosmos, the harmony of the microcosm and macrocosm, the principles whispered by Thoth and carried across civilizations. The monks often worked at night, under the weak glow of lamps, speaking only in whispers to each other when copying a particularly complex symbol. They feared the scrutiny of outsiders, yet they understood that these symbols were alive, waiting to be recognized by a mind brave enough to follow their logic. Sometimes, the diagrams appeared alongside cryptic annotations in Latin or the scribes' native tongues. Short phrases like, "as above, so below," or "the stars weigh the soul." These were instructions, not moral lessons, a call to experience knowledge directly. A monk could read a Bible or a theological treatise and see salvation mediated through clergy, but a hermetic diagram offered something different, a path that could not be mediated, a gnosis that belonged to the individual seeker. The Church feared this because certainty granted by personal experience threatened the monopoly of belief, carefully enforced over generations. Over decades, centuries even, these diagrams multiplied. Margins of manuscripts in monasteries from Paris to Toledo carried silent maps of hermetic thought. Some were copied, others hidden beneath later texts. Some were tucked into bindings, folded in ways that no casual reader would notice. And in those hidden corners, the ideas of Thoth survived. They endured because they were subtle, encoded, and above all, impossible to eradicate completely. The monks, without realizing it, were keepers of a dangerous secret. They were the guardians of knowledge that could challenge the certainty of kings, popes, and priests. They copied in whispers, they drew in margins, and in doing so, they allowed the flame of hermetic wisdom to survive the centuries. What Rome feared was not demons or sin, but the diagrams that promised understanding without obedience, that offered the world a scribe who weighed hearts rather than absolved sins, and that quietly placed power back into the hands of the seeker. In the bustling streets of Florence, during the late 15th century, a new energy pulsed through art, philosophy, and politics. Scholars gathered in sunlit courtyards and shadowed chambers, debating the nature of man, the cosmos, and God. Among them, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola and Marsilio Ficino became conduits for ideas older than Europe itself. They dug into dusty manuscripts that had survived centuries of marginal notes, careful copying, and the quiet vigilance of monks. These were hermetic texts, the teachings attributed to Thoth, the Egyptian scribe god who measured truth, not simply preached it. Pico saw in these writings a vision of human potential that was exhilarating and terrifying. He wrote of the dignity of man, the ability of the soul to ascend through knowledge, and the power of understanding the universe directly. Ficino, under the patronage of Lorenzo de' Medici, translated Greek texts into Latin, making the Hermetica accessible to a new generation of thinkers. Together, they orchestrated a revival of ancient wisdom that mingled seamlessly with Christian thought on the surface. To the world, it was philosophy, classical learning, and art flourishing in harmony. Beneath it, however, lay a more subversive current. The Hermetic texts emphasized experience over decree. They spoke of the cosmos as alive, responsive, and connected to the human soul. This challenged the centuries-old monopoly of Rome, which had dictated truth through dogma, scripture, and priestly interpretation. The Church tolerated a certain amount of philosophical exploration because it appeared scholarly and pious, but private chambers whispered with unease. Cardinals and popes understood that the Hermetica offered certainty without mediation. It promised gnosis, direct understanding of God and the cosmos, bypassing the clergy entirely. Florentine salons became laboratories of thought. Artists incorporated Hermetic symbolism into their paintings, from the geometric patterns of perspective to allegorical figures embodying cosmic principles. Mathematicians, astronomers, and astrologers decoded the secrets of celestial movement encoded in Hermetic diagrams. Even musicians experimented with harmony that reflected the proportions of the universe. The Medici court, powerful and shrewd, nurtured these experiments because they enhanced prestige and influence. But they too knew Rome's private disapproval could erupt if the wrong observer noticed too much. Despite the outward appearance of Renaissance celebration, the revival was cautious. Certain manuscripts were copied in secret. Footnotes, marginalia, and letters circulated quietly among trusted intellectuals. Rome officially celebrated humanism and classical learning, but privately it monitored these circles. It feared that Hermetic knowledge could shift authority from the church to the individual. If a scholar discovered the laws of the universe and the pattern of divine creation without priestly guidance, the very structure of ecclesiastical power was undermined. In this delicate dance, Florence became a bridge between worlds. Ancient Egypt's wisdom, preserved by Greek and Arabic scholars, found a home in the Italian Renaissance. Rome smiled when invited to public lectures and salons, but behind velvet curtains, cardinals counted the cost of knowledge that could no longer be fully controlled. The Hermetica was alive again, and with it, the memory of Thoth, the scribe who weighed hearts and kept secrets, walked silently among the thinkers, waiting for the moment when the hidden truths might ripple beyond Florence's walls. In the shadowed workshops of Renaissance Europe, alchemists stirred bubbling flasks, weighed powders, and watched flames dance over crucibles. To the casual observer, they appeared to be chasing gold, obsessed with turning lead into something valuable and shining. Yet, the Hermetic alchemists were speaking in a double tongue. Their true aim was never material wealth. The processes, the symbols, and the diagrams concealed a more dangerous quest, the transformation of the soul itself. Each chemical reaction, each layering of salts and minerals was a metaphor for inner purification. The Church had long assumed that spiritual authority flowed from its hierarchy through sacraments and by obedience. Alchemy suggested otherwise. It implied that man could awaken knowledge, reshape the self, and access the divine directly. Hermetic alchemists drew from texts attributed to Thoth, Hermes Trismegistus, and other ancient sages. Their writings spoke in riddles, using elements, planets, and metals as symbols for virtues, vices, and cosmic forces. Mercury was not just a metal, but fluid intellect. Sulfur represented courage and fire of the soul. Salt embodied stability and grounding. Each furnace became a chapel where the alchemist performed rites of transformation, silently, under candlelight, with diagrams etched on stone walls and vellum. The Church noticed that these laboratories were not just places of curiosity, they were potential threats. A person who could transform internally did not need confession, did not require indulgences, and did not rely on clerical authority for salvation. The double tongue served a purpose. Alchemists could explain experiments publicly in terms of metals and chemical reactions, drawing admiration from patrons and scholars. Privately, the same texts instructed on meditation, ritual, and inner vision. Words were layered, images hidden, and meanings folded over meanings. Anyone lacking the proper context or lineage of instruction would see only laboratory procedures, unaware of the spiritual revolution quietly encoded in their hands. This secrecy kept the alchemists alive. Misstep, misinterpretation, or suspicion of heresy could lead to imprisonment or worse. Yet, the real fear of Rome was not the pursuit of gold. It was the idea that knowledge could be liberated from its control. Patrons, often powerful nobles, collected these laboratories as much for prestige as for potential profit. The Medici in Florence and various German princes encouraged alchemical experiments, fascinated by the spectacle of transmutation. They may not have understood the spiritual undertones, but the alchemists knew their power. Hidden in their flasks and furnaces was a doctrine older than Europe itself, a direct line to the teachings of Thoth, suggesting that the cosmos and the human soul were mirrors, and mastery over one implied insight into the other. By the 16th century, alchemy had spread across Europe, embedded in scientific discourse, art, and even early medicine. Yet the Church monitored every word and every diagram. Hermetic alchemy was both a tool and a threat. It promised not temptation, not damnation, but empowerment, and that was more dangerous than any heretic shouting from a pulpit. The alchemists did not just seek gold, they sought the impossible, a path to transcendence that bypassed Rome entirely, and in that pursuit they held a mirror to a power the Vatican feared more than Satan himself. In dimly lit workshops and monasteries across Europe, artists and scribes drew patterns that seemed simple to the untrained eye. A snake eating its tail, two circles overlapping, a staff entwined with serpents. These symbols were more than decoration. They were geometry that whispered secrets, a language without words. The Church had long relied on sermons, scrolls, and ritual to teach morality and the divine order. Geometry taught differently. It showed, it demonstrated, and it bypassed intermediaries entirely. A viewer who looked carefully could understand patterns of creation, cycles of life, and the alignment between heaven and earth without ever opening a Bible or hearing a priest. The caduceus, the intertwined serpents on a winged staff, appeared in Greek and Egyptian sources long before it became familiar in European manuscripts. Alchemists and Hermetic scholars adopted it as a symbol of duality and harmony, of opposites balanced, of energy circulating through the body and cosmos. To the Church, a symbol that suggested the divine could be known through observation and insight rather than obedience and prayer was dangerous. It undermined authority quietly, subtly, without a single word of heresy being spoken. The Ouroboros, a snake devouring its own tail, taught the cyclical nature of existence and eternity. It was used in manuscripts, carved on book covers, painted in margins. Some alchemists wrote treatises entirely in Ouroboros-inspired diagrams, conveying lessons about self-reflection, regeneration, and transformation. To those trained, it explained life, death, and rebirth as a continuous process, showing that knowledge and power were accessible from within. It suggested that salvation might be experiential, immediate, and independent of Rome. The Vesica Piscis, two overlapping circles forming an almond shape, appeared in stained glass, church windows, and manuscript illuminations. To the untrained eye, it was simple art, a decorative flourish. To the initiated, it represented the meeting of worlds, the divine intersecting with the human, the birth of insight. It could encode proportions, harmony, and sacred ratios, showing that understanding was built into the world itself. In some cases, hidden measurements aligned with celestial movements, linking human structures to cosmic rhythms. Throughout the Renaissance, these symbols spread like hidden currents. Hermeticists, artists, and scholars encoded knowledge where it could survive the Church's scrutiny. Geometry became a secret grammar for teaching wisdom that could not be erased. Books, paintings, altars, even tombstones were written with it, creating a network of visual instruction that travelled across Europe without leaving a single overt trace. Rome's fear was profound. Words could be censored, heretics punished, manuscripts destroyed. Symbols could not. They persisted in margins, mosaics, and architectural forms, quietly teaching generations who knew how to see. Forbidden geometry was a language of liberation, a direct line to understanding creation itself. It suggested that God, the cosmos, and the human soul were knowable by observation, insight, and experience, not just decree. And that knowledge, once understood, could never be unlearned, challenging authority in ways no sermon ever could. Imagine holding a deck of cards that feels heavier than it should, each card a universe, each symbol a door. The Book of Thoth is not a book in the traditional sense. It is a deck created by Thoth, the Egyptian scribe god, or so legend claims. Its origins are lost in the shifting sands of history, whispered in Alexandria, carried across the Mediterranean, and finally taking form in Europe during the Renaissance. Unlike a Bible or manuscript, the deck moves. It travels in pockets and satchels, it can be shuffled, dealt, and read anywhere. It is not tied to a pulpit, a monastery, or a decree. It is knowledge made portable, intimate, and immediate. The cards themselves are layered with meaning. Every suit, every number, every figure represents not just an object or character, but an archetype. The magician, the high priestess, the fool, the tower. Each is a mirror for the mind, a reflection of the soul. To draw a card is to confront your own nature, your fears, desires, and potential. It is experience without mediation, insight without a priest. That is why Rome feared it more than the devil. The devil tempts outwardly, encouraging sin and indulgence. The Book of Thoth tempts inwardly, showing truths no hierarchy can control. Regulation was attempted. Kings and popes banned the cards, condemned their use, claimed them tools of sorcery or heresy. Secret courts burned decks, and yet the practice persisted. The knowledge inside could not be destroyed because it is experiential. You cannot erase a lesson once it is lived. Those who learned the symbols, the connections, the patterns, could carry them across generations. The cards do not speak, they reveal. They are a language of the soul, a private oracle that requires no permission, no blessing, no intermediary. Artists and alchemists helped shape the tarot into a visual code that could survive censorship. Symbols from Hermetic texts, Egyptian imagery, and medieval mysticism were layered onto the cards, encoding lessons in metaphor and pattern. The deck became a map for the mind, a mirror for consciousness, and in the hands of the learned, a portable temple. You could sit alone in a room or walk through a garden and read the same lessons. The tarot democratized access to the sacred. Over centuries, the tarot spread quietly. Scholars, magicians, mystics, and courtiers used it to explore morality, fate, and destiny. It traveled from Florence to Paris, from Spain to England, each deck slightly different, yet all carrying the same essence. And everywhere it went, authorities attempted to control it. They failed. Knowledge that is experienced, rather than dictated, cannot be controlled. The Book of Thoth teaches through engagement, through reflection, through revelation. It reads the seeker as much as the seeker reads it. That is why a deck of cards became a threat greater than any sermon, a challenge to every claim of authority, and a reason Rome feared Thoth more than Satan himself. Giordano Bruno was not your typical Renaissance thinker. Born in 1558 in Nola, Italy, he walked into a world where the stars were fixed, the heavens were orderly, and the church's authority was absolute. Yet Bruno dared to imagine differently. He saw the cosmos not as a closed stage for human morality, but as a vast, infinite expanse, filled with countless suns, planets, and perhaps even life beyond our own. His vision did not merely challenge the sky. It challenged the very structure of dogma, the notion that the universe could be mapped and controlled by decree. Bruno's philosophy was deeply hermetic. He believed that the divine was not distant or separate from the natural world, but present in all things. Each star, each planet, each mind contained sparks of the infinite. Knowledge was not something granted by priests or found in parchment alone. It was experienced, understood through contemplation, study, and a fearless imagination. The church called him heretic. He called himself a seeker. In his mind, to limit the universe was to limit God, and to limit God was to blind the human spirit. He travelled across Europe, from Venice to Geneva, from England to France, speaking in the courts of kings and universities, leaving behind whispered lessons as he went. His ideas were dangerous because they dissolved hierarchy. If the cosmos is infinite, then human authority is finite. If the divine is everywhere, then no intermediary, no pope, no canon can monopolize truth. Bruno's Hermetic vision made certainty impossible. It made obedience less appealing and curiosity irresistible. In 1593, Bruno returned to Rome, thinking he could reconcile with the Church. Instead, he was imprisoned, interrogated, and condemned. His writings, filled with visions of multiple worlds, magical correspondences, and the unity of all things, were branded heretical. In February of 195, he was led to the Campo de' Fiori. The streets were filled with silence as flames consumed him. His body perished, but his ideas did not. They ignited in secret, whispered in libraries, copied into margins, and carried across Europe by those willing to see beyond walls. Bruno's universe was a challenge to the notion that knowledge could be contained. It was a sky without borders, a map that no church could redraw. To the Vatican, he was more terrifying than Satan. Satan tempts the soul, but Bruno revealed that the soul itself is capable of seeing, knowing, and reaching beyond earthly constraints. His heresy was not in disbelief, but in showing the infinite potential of human thought. Today, we look back and see Bruno as a martyr, a philosopher, and a prophet of curiosity. His cosmos is no longer a secret. Telescopes and satellites confirm what he intuited. The universe is vast, possibly teeming, and endlessly mysterious. Yet the lesson of Bruno remains hermetic. Knowledge is not granted. It is encountered. It is infinite, just like the worlds he imagined, and just like the minds that continue to follow his fearless gaze into the sky without walls. In 1559, the Vatican officially created a list meant to control knowledge, a list that would become infamous as the Index Librorum Prohibitorum. The idea was simple, terrifying in its efficiency. If ideas could not be destroyed by fire, they could be destroyed by invisibility. Books that challenged doctrine, questioned authority, or revealed knowledge outside sanctioned limits were forbidden. They were not merely criticized, they were buried behind walls of silence, restricted from public access, made almost impossible to touch without permission. This was not a simple act of censorship. It was a strategic containment. The Church understood that ideas, once read, could ignite curiosity, challenge obedience, and destabilize centuries of hierarchical control. A book is dangerous, not because it burns, but because it teaches. The Index became a mechanism for spiritual quarantine. Authors like Giordano Bruno, whose ideas danced with infinity, were banned. Hermetic texts that taught direct experience of the divine, texts that suggested humans could access hidden truths without priests or papal blessing, were hidden from sight. Enforcement of the Index was subtle yet pervasive. Libraries under Catholic control required approval for access. Forbidden texts were removed from circulation or locked behind restricted doors. Even copying a marginal note from a Hermetic manuscript could be dangerous. The Index created a culture of fear, but also of ingenuity. Scholars who sought forbidden knowledge learned to whisper, to copy in shadows, to circulate ideas through coded letters, marginalia, and secret study circles. Rome could not erase thought entirely, but it could slow it, obscure it, make it invisible to the casual seeker. Over the centuries, the Index grew. By 1758, it contained thousands of titles. It wasn't limited to heresy in the traditional sense. Scientific works, philosophical treatises, and even literature that suggested the world might be older than Genesis, or that the soul could access knowledge independently, were included. Each forbidden book was a crack in the monopoly on truth, and each restriction was a testament to the Church's awareness of that danger. The birth of the Index illustrates a paradox. Knowledge cannot be destroyed, yet it can be controlled. Flame and sword are too blunt for ideas. Silence and restriction, however, are precise. The Vatican did not fear Thoth or Hermes because they could tempt, but because they could transmit. They transmitted understanding, perception, and certainty to anyone daring to see beyond dogma. The Index was Rome's response, not to deny the existence of forbidden truths, but to hide them, bury them beneath centuries of access, waiting for those clever enough or persistent enough to rediscover them. In the shadows of restricted libraries, in the coded margins of forbidden texts, the Index left its fingerprints. It is a silent war, a contest not of armies but of attention, where knowledge survives in whispers and secret transmission, and where the most dangerous flame is the one that cannot be seen. In 1623, a Jesuit missionary named Matteo Ricci was sent to China not just to convert, but to observe, to record, to translate. His journals became more than travel logs. They were a map of knowledge, a catalogue of ideas he encountered in faraway lands. In his reports, he sketched diagrams he found in local manuscripts, some of which seemed mundane at first glance, but when examined through the hermetic lens, revealed a pattern, a method of encoding understanding. The shapes, circles, interlocking lines, and spirals were more than decoration. They were instructions for thinking, for perceiving the world in a way that bypassed conventional authority. Ricci's work reached Rome slowly, carried by courier ships across oceans. Yet when the diagrams were finally studied by the Vatican scholars, the reaction was one of alarm. It was not the exotic lands or foreign gods that worried them. It was the method itself, the way knowledge could be transmitted secretly, universally, and without mediation. A page could carry power, a diagram could teach certainty. The Church realized that the danger of Hermetic tradition was not a story, not a temptation of the flesh, but the very act of knowing, structured and repeatable. The Jesuits themselves understood this power. Matteo Ricci had been trained in mathematics, astronomy, and classical languages. He recognized that these diagrams, when followed carefully, allowed the mind to perceive correspondences between heaven and earth, between human and divine. It was a roadmap for gnosis, a method of personal illumination that did not require confession, indulgence, or obedience. In Rome, the thought that a missionary in the East could carry such knowledge across continents made the problem feel immediate and tangible. The Vatican responded quietly, deliberately. Access to Ricci's full reports was restricted. Scholars were warned to treat the diagrams with extreme caution. Copies were limited, indexed, and reviewed by the Inquisition. The fear was not of demon spirits, nor of heretical seduction, but of methodical comprehension that undermined centuries of doctrinal control. A single diagram in the wrong hands could teach someone to see truths the Church had worked for centuries to conceal or reinterpret. This episode highlighted a critical lesson. The Church could manage myths, ban books, or condemn heretics, but a method of understanding was harder to suppress. Knowledge transmitted by procedure, by visual structure, by encoded process, could survive centuries, borders, and languages. A well-trained mind could follow the logic independently and arrive at forbidden insight. Rome realized that controlling faith was only possible if method was contained. Ricci's diagram, quietly tucked in a missionary report, became a symbol of this realization. Thoth, Hermes, and the Hermetic tradition were dangerous not because of spells or angels, but because they offered a way to think clearly and see directly. The Jesuit and the cipher revealed that Rome's fear was not of myth or story, but of replication, understanding, and the unstoppable transmission of knowledge that required no priest, no pope, no intermediary at all. In the year 1574, the Church celebrated victories over demons with sermons, rituals, and art depicting the fall of Satan. The Prince of Darkness was a figure Rome could control. You could name him, you could battle him, you could bind him with prayers and holy water. Satan could be defeated, confined, and explained. He was a narrative, a story, with a beginning, middle, and end. His danger was theatrical, manageable, contained. Thoth, however, was different. Thoth was not a creature to fight, but an idea to see. He carried no horns, no claws, no temptation of the flesh. He carried knowledge, the act of understanding itself. In Alexandria, centuries before, Thoth had written in symbols and diagrams instructions for perception and insight. The same knowledge that filtered through Greek, Arabic, and Latin scholars arrived centuries later in Europe, reaching the hands of thinkers, magicians, and even missionaries. Thoth demanded comprehension, reflection, and engagement. Unlike Satan, you could not fight him or exorcise him. You could only follow, and following led to a dangerous independence. The Church quickly realized the threat. A believer armed with the Hermetic method could bypass confession, ignore indulgences, and perceive truth without clergy. The danger was structural. Satan tempted individuals, but Thoth taught autonomy. The mirror Thoth held reflected a person's ability to discern the divine without Rome's permission. This was subversive in a way demons never were. A heretic could be burned at the stake, a town could be purged, but method could not be fully destroyed. Once someone learned to think in the Hermetic way, the Church could no longer dictate the boundaries of their soul. In private, councils debated the problem. Should Hermetic texts be destroyed or hidden? How could diagrams and symbols that instructed rather than seduced be controlled? Rome's response was slow, careful, and relentless. The Inquisition indexed books, censored manuscripts, and monitored scholars, yet knowledge survived in margins, in drawings, in whispered lessons passed from master to student. Thoth's mirror persisted quietly, reflecting the capacity for understanding, for insight, for certainty, without obedience. By the late 16th century, the contrast was clear. Satan remained the scapegoat of sin, a figure whose defeat reinforced the Church's authority. Thoth, Hermes, the Hermetic tradition, threatened to dissolve authority entirely. It was not about fear of evil, but fear of insight. Knowledge could not be exorcised. It could only be feared, restricted, and occasionally studied in silence. Rome's choice became obvious. Satan could be allowed, ritualized, dramatized. Thoth could not. Thoth demanded the impossible, comprehension without submission. And so the Egyptian scribe, the cosmic librarian, the keeper of hidden laws, became the adversary Rome feared more than any prince of hell. The mirror he held was not malevolent, yet it reflected something terrifying, a mind fully awake, fully free, and no longer dependent on the Church to know God. Walk into any Gothic cathedral in the year 1542 and look closely. Every arch, every column, every window is more than decoration. They are lessons, puzzles, whispers of knowledge meant to survive even when books are burned. Architects were not just builders, they were keepers of Thoth's method, embedding Hermetic ratios into stone so that anyone who knew how to see could read the message. Geometry became a language no priest could fully control. The nave stretches in precise proportions, the aisles reflect numerical relationships, and the rose window is more than beauty, it is instruction. Fibonacci spirals, the golden ratio, the vesica piscis, all hidden in plain sight, waiting for a mind trained in observation to decode them. Cathedrals were built to last centuries, and so too were the teachings encoded in their foundations. Builders risked censure, not because the Church opposed construction, but because the knowledge whispered through their work challenged authority in subtle ways. Freemason lodges in Florence and Venice followed the same principle. In the year 1576, lodge blueprints reveal careful use of symbolic geometry. Columns align with celestial events. Altars mark equinoxes. Ceilings reference the Hermetic cosmology without uttering a word. The Church could see the stone and marble and brick, but comprehension required something more. It required initiation, observation, and experience. A whisper carried across centuries through the hands of masons and architects. City plans became the next frontier. In Paris and Rome, medieval streets were laid according to alignments no mapmaker dared explain openly. Squares formed pentagons, intersections formed stars, lines cut across neighborhoods, marking invisible paths. They were not random, but deliberate, a silent rebellion against spiritual monopoly. Anyone walking the streets could see only streets, but someone trained in hermetic observation could perceive maps of knowledge, paths of initiation, and encoded cosmologies. The city became an unreadable book to most, but a living classroom to the initiated. Even private estates reflected this. In the year 1602, a villa outside Florence features gardens arranged according to ratios found in the Hermetic texts. Fountains mark planets, hedges echo spirals, and the layout contains layers of meaning that ordinary visitors could never guess. The owners were patrons, protectors, and practitioners of a subtle descent, ensuring that Thoth's ideas outlived the purges of texts and the fear of the Inquisition. The Church noticed, of course. Investigations into unapproved architecture increased. Councils debated the influence of geometry on faith. Yet stone is stubborn. Unlike a book, it cannot be burned in secret. It cannot be hidden in a shelf. It cannot be rewritten easily. Geometry whispers, and whispers endure. By embedding hermetic knowledge in structures, architects created a sanctuary of insight beyond the reach of dogma. Buildings, streets, and windows became living lessons, teaching observation, perception, and autonomy. Thoth's method moved silently through Europe, carved into the world itself, waiting for eyes capable of understanding. The scribe of Egypt had moved from papyrus to stone, leaving a language too subtle for most to notice, but too permanent for any authority to erase. In the year 1510, a young Swiss physician named Paracelsus wandered through the streets of Basel with a notebook and a fierce curiosity. He was not content with the traditional teachings of Galen or Avicenna, nor with the prayers that promised healing from a priest alone. Instead, he drank deeply from the hermetic fountain attributed to Thoth. Mercury, the messenger, became his symbol for transformation. His experiments combined observation, chemistry, and a strange reverence for the unseen forces in nature. Paracelsus believed that understanding the world required direct experience, not mere adherence to doctrine. He saw the hand of the divine in the reactions of metals, the properties of herbs, and the rhythms of the stars. Across Europe, alchemists, natural philosophers, and mathematicians began to follow similar threads. In the year 1650, Isaac Newton, studying under candlelight in Cambridge, wrote not only about gravity, but about hidden correspondences in nature. He annotated his copies of the Hermetic corpus with care, exploring the alchemy of metals and the mathematics of the heavens. The credo of obedience to church dogma slowly gave way to observation, experimentation, and calculation. What once required confession now required proof, measurement, and reasoning. Thoth's influence was subtle but profound, threading through the hands of anyone daring enough to read nature as text. Hermetic philosophy taught these early scientists that knowledge is a living current, something to be understood by experience and intuition. The universe was not a closed book dictated by priests. It was an open text to be read through careful study, mathematics, and alchemical practice. Paracelsus tested chemicals in ways that terrified conservative physicians, blending mysticism with empirical rigor. Newton calculated the motions of planets with the same intensity he applied to experiments with light and reflection. The idea that the divine could be approached directly through reason and observation, rather than through intermediaries, was radical. The Church noticed the shift. Heresy trials became less about explicit beliefs and more about methods. Those who pursued Hermetic methods threatened authority not by preaching rebellion, but by proving that knowledge could be accessed outside sanctioned channels. By the year 1700, laboratories replaced monasteries as sites of power. Alchemical furnaces, chemical reactions, and planetary observations became the new language of influence. Mercury replaced the crucifix in the minds of some scholars. The scribe god had moved from papyrus and stone into the hearts of experimenters. By the time Robert Boyle was conducting experiments in London in the year 1665, the Hermetic legacy was woven into the very fabric of modern science. Calculus, optics, chemical reactions, and the periodic investigation of nature carried echoes of Thoth's teachings. The messenger of the gods, the scribe, and the secret librarian of the cosmos had become a patron for those willing to see and measure for themselves. Knowledge was no longer a gift dispensed from pulpits, but a current flowing from careful observation to bold theory. In classrooms, laboratories, and private studies across Europe, the doctors of Mercury transformed the way humans interacted with reality. They replaced faith alone with faith informed by evidence. They translated the whispers of ancient scribes into experiments, formulas, and the beginnings of modern understanding. And all the while, Thoth watched silently, the scribe who had always weighed hearts and measured truth, smiling at the persistence of knowledge through those willing to carry it forward. In the year 33, on the dusty streets of Jerusalem, a man walked who would change the world. Christ, known to some as the Logos made flesh, preached not just laws but revelation. He spoke of the kingdom within, the spark of divine consciousness in every human heart. To many, his message was simple: look inward, seek understanding, and let the Spirit guide your actions. Yet, there were those who saw layers beneath the surface. Hermetic Christians, influenced by traditions stretching back to Thoth and the scribes of Egypt, read Christ not only as Saviour, but as embodiment of hidden wisdom. By the year 200, in Alexandria, a city where scrolls filled towering libraries and scholars debated into the night, Christian and Hermetic ideas began to intertwine. Gnostic texts circulated quietly, emphasizing knowledge over obedience. Christ was interpreted as the Logos, the divine word, the eternal principle underlying creation. This Logos was not an external law imposed from Rome, but a living spark within each soul. Those who embraced this synthesis saw the crucifixion not as the final punishment, but as an allegory for inner transformation. Salvation became something to experience, to realize, rather than to inherit from priests or perform through ritual alone. The Church watched with suspicion. By the year 390, Emperor Theodosius declared Nicene Christianity the empire's official faith. Texts that challenged authority, that suggested Christ's wisdom was accessible directly to the individual, were suppressed. Hermetic Christians were careful, hiding their scrolls and copying them in secret. In dimly lit rooms, they studied the Emerald Tablet alongside the Gospel of John, tracing connections between Thoth's teachings and the Christ, who spoke of light, truth, and eternal life within. By the year 1200, these ideas had spread across Europe, often disguised as mystical treatises or commentaries on alchemy. Monks in monasteries annotated margins with symbols, caduceus, vesica piscis, and the all-seeing eye, reminders that knowledge transcended Rome's control. Christ as Logos became a quiet rebellion, a way to honor divine intelligence without invoking explicit heresy. Those who understood the synthesis could see the path to God through observation, meditation, and the study of nature itself. The synthesis also influenced art, architecture, and ritual. Stained glass in French cathedrals sometimes depicted Christ with symbols of Thoth subtly included. Paintings showed him holding not just a scroll but a staff, a cipher of hidden wisdom. Alchemists and scholars whispered of the Egyptian Christ in Latin manuscripts hidden beneath monastery floors. Rome could not sanction it because it undermined hierarchy. If divine knowledge resided in every heart, the power of priests, bishops, and popes diminished. The Egyptian Christ was dangerous not because he promised damnation, but because he promised understanding. By the year 1500, Hermetic Christianity had seeded the Renaissance. Pico della Mirandola and Marsilio Ficino studied these texts, drawing parallels between Christ's inner light and the Hermetic quest for truth. Art, science, and philosophy became vehicles for this subtle transmission. Rome continued to clamp down publicly, while curious minds carried the secret quietly forward. The Egyptian Christ lived in ideas, in symbols, and in the hearts of those who sought the divine within rather than above. And even today, traces of this synthesis remain, waiting for those willing to look past the walls of doctrine into the spark that never dies. In the year 1550, inside the shadowed halls of the Vatican, a man named Giovanni Battista kept a secret. Officially, he was the papal astronomer, charting stars for calendars and feasts, but in private, he traced patterns invisible to ordinary eyes. He studied not just planets, but the subtle geometry of the cosmos, hermetic ratios, hidden in the arcs of constellations, and the spiral of galaxies. His observations revealed connections between the heavens and the divine spark within humans, a dangerous knowledge that could shift authority from the clergy to the individual. Giovanni's notebooks were filled with diagrams, overlays of stars, and lines connecting distant worlds in ways that mirrored sacred geometry on Earth. The courier received internal memos warning him to maintain silence. Integration of such knowledge, the memos argued, was riskier than outright denial. If the faithful realized that the patterns of the heavens reflected the Logos within, the Church's control over salvation would be challenged. Temples and pulpits relied on mediation. Hermetic astronomy offered direct insight. The Vatican had tolerated curiosity, but now feared comprehension. Despite the warnings, Giovanni continued his work in hidden chambers beneath the observatory. He aligned astrolabes to the solstices and equinoxes, calculating the positions of planets with meticulous precision. Each alignment revealed symbolic correspondences, from the caduceus to the vesica piscis, tracing connections between Mercury, the messenger of the gods, and the human mind capable of understanding divine law. He wrote about the mirror of the cosmos, a concept that the sky itself reflected the inner life of the soul. The Church feared this mirror because it could show that God was accessible without priests, without indulgences, without ritual. Letters to colleagues in Florence hinted at deeper investigations. Giovanni suggested that sacred texts and hermetic diagrams encoded the same cosmic principles, that the layout of cathedrals mirrored the heavens, and that mathematics was a language of revelation. If disseminated, such insights could destabilize centuries of ecclesiastical hierarchy. Rome had learned from history. Books were burned, heretics executed, monasteries silenced. Yet knowledge, like water, seeped through cracks. The stars were not owned by popes. By the year 1560, rumours circulated in Rome of a cosmic heretic, a man whose maps of the skies whispered truths forbidden to common eyes. Giovanni's work influenced other thinkers, some destined to ignite the scientific revolution. Figures like Tycho Brahe and Galileo would later chart the heavens openly, but Giovanni's insights remained private, encoded in notebooks whose margins hinted at hermetic correspondences. The Church, aware of the danger, allowed him cautious freedom but monitored every step. Giovanni understood the stakes. Knowledge of the hermetic sky was not blasphemy, it was subversion. It revealed a universe in which divine order could be known directly, not mediated. The papal astronomer moved between obedience and revelation, navigating a dangerous tightrope. His silence preserved his life, but ensured that the hermetic sky remained a secret map, a whisper of truth in the shadow of power. And long after he passed, scholars would find fragments of his work, glimpses of a cosmos that reflected not only the stars above, but the divine potential within every human being. In the 20th century, Thoth did not appear as a god with ibis head, or as a hermetic scribe. Instead, he emerged in the quiet frameworks of thought humans call psychology, systems theory, and code. Carl Jung, in Zurich in the year 1920 spoke of archetypes and the collective unconscious, describing patterns of mind and spirit that reflected universal principles. These principles were echoes of Thoth's teachings: correspondence, iteration, self-reflection. The Church observed cautiously, understanding that this modern Thoth threatened authority in subtle, almost invisible ways. Systems theorists in the 1950s and 60s, people like Ludwig von Bertalanffy, began mapping the relationships between parts and wholes. Feedback loops, adaptive networks, and interconnections created a language that paralleled Hermetic philosophy. As above, so below became a mantra for scientists studying complex systems, where the microcosm mirrored the macrocosm. Thoth's method had moved from papyrus to the blackboard. Knowledge was no longer just a secret, it was a pattern waiting to be recognized. Computer scientists entered the scene in the 1950s, building machines that could calculate, simulate, and iterate endlessly. Alan Turing, in 1936, wrote about machines that could think, systems that could test themselves, refine themselves. In the logic of code, Thoth returned again, not as a mystical figure, but as method itself. Algorithms, loops, and recursive functions reflected the same Hermetic ideas once whispered in Alexandria. Observation, record, reflection, correction. The scribe god's work had become digital. Psychologists, engineers, and programmers unknowingly followed the same path as the monks who once annotated Hermetic margins in secrecy. The Church had feared open Hermetic knowledge because it gave power directly to the seeker. Modern science and technology do the same, democratizing comprehension. Humans could now understand patterns of mind, matter, and machine without mediation. That ability was frightening because it placed insight in the hands of anyone who learned the method. The mirror Thoth held now reflected through computers, textbooks, and laboratories. Therapists in clinics, scientists in labs, and programmers at terminals all became unwitting inheritors of the scribe's work. Self-observation, iteration, correspondence, these were the tools Thoth had always used. Jung's dream analysis, cybernetic feedback loops, machine learning algorithms, all were modern masks of an ancient wisdom. The Church no longer needed to burn books to contain this knowledge. The danger lay in comprehension itself, in the quiet realization that systems could reveal truths independently. By the year 2000, Thoth's method was everywhere. In apps that track habits, in AI that predicts patterns, in therapy sessions, mapping personality traits, his fingerprints were embedded in the structures of daily life. The scribe god had transcended iconography and temples, existing now as process, as technique, as insight. The Vatican could no longer monitor these flows, could no longer forbid comprehension. Thoth's modern masks made knowledge accessible, persistent, and unstoppable. The god of transmission had returned in a form the world could not burn, a presence encoded into the very systems humans relied upon to understand themselves and the universe. In the 21st century, the Vatican archives no longer smelled of dust and candle wax alone. They hummed with servers and scanned manuscripts, their contents rendered into bytes, metadata, and encrypted digital shelves. Access was no longer limited by papal blessing or centuries of privilege. Now, algorithms tracked every query, every download, every anomaly. In the year 2010, researchers noticed odd glitches. Metadata fields marked restricted appeared where no policy existed, timestamps shifted in impossible sequences, and some scanned texts seemed to vanish without explanation. What looked like bureaucracy or accident might have been something else entirely. A codex from the year 1400 was scanned and uploaded in 2012. Scholars accessing the digital copy found that words had been subtly altered. Names of obscure Hermetic figures were replaced, diagrams distorted, and marginal notes redacted. At first, this was written off as human error, a misreading by the OCR software, but patterns emerged. Across dozens of manuscripts, redactions followed the same sequence. The alterations were too precise, too consistent to be random. Someone, or something, was watching what people looked for and intervening, silently shaping comprehension. Digital historians began to map anomalies. Pages removed in the archive often correlated with references to Thoth, Hermetic texts, or forbidden lineages. Files with odd timestamps corresponded to politically sensitive papal eras, sometimes spanning centuries in documentation, but converging in metadata loops that defied explanation. The archive seemed aware not just of what was in the collection, but of what was being sought. Queries about secret knowledge returned results intentionally incomplete. The digital shelves were curating, censoring, and guiding attention invisibly. Researchers compared this behavior to classical mechanisms of suppression. In the past, priests burned manuscripts or restricted access to libraries. Now, the archive used the tools of the age: code, metadata, and networked control. It monitored without notice, redirecting inquiry, leaving gaps where curiosity might uncover too much. Unlike fire, which destroys, this method preserved the content but hid it in plain sight, accessible only to those who knew how to read the signals embedded in anomalies, timestamps, and file properties. By the year 2020, AI-assisted researchers began noticing layers of hidden patterns. Subtle coding in image files, in the margins of digitized manuscripts, in errant Unicode characters, suggested an awareness baked into the archive itself. Was it deliberate human intervention, or an emergent property of a system designed to catalogue and index a library of secrets? The line blurred. Thoth's method of hidden transmission, once carried through papyrus and secret marginalia, had now adapted to digital form. Knowledge could be monitored, redirected, and preserved without any human hand touching a page. The archive no longer waited passively. It watched back. It recorded curiosity, mapped attention, and maintained control without fire or sword. In this new era, suppression was not destruction, but invisibility. Forbidden knowledge persisted, encoded, layered, and patient. The Vatican's oldest secrets now slept inside servers, algorithms, and metadata, waiting for the careful eye, the persistent mind, the seeker who could recognize patterns in absence. Even in digital silence, the archive communicated its power. It was not just a repository of history. It was a sentinel, a mirror, a living system, and the most modern mask of Thoth yet, guarding truths too dangerous to expose, and guiding the world toward revelation by method, not accident. The question that echoes through vaulted halls and candlelit studies is deceptively simple. Why would the Vatican fear Thoth more than Satan? Devils can be contained. They appear in stories, in confession, in the ritualized exorcisms of the faithful. They tempt, they threaten, they promise power that can be managed and punished. Thoth, however, does not tempt. Thoth teaches. In the year 2310 before our Common Era, the Egyptians imagined him recording deeds and weighing hearts. But his power was never in punishment. It was in revelation. Knowledge, once given, cannot be unlearned. To teach is to shift authority. Priests command, bishops legislate, popes dictate. Their power depends on intermediation. The faithful must rely on them to interpret scripture, to translate doctrine, to mediate salvation. A scribe, a teacher, a transmitter of hidden wisdom undermines that system. When someone can read the cosmos, decode the divine, and perform the same function as a priest through insight rather than ordination, the hierarchy becomes optional. Authority is no longer conferred by office. It is recognized by comprehension. Thoth's gift is replicable. History offers cautionary tales. In the year 1492, Hermetic texts circulated in Florence among learned circles. Pico della Mirandola and Marsilio Ficino studied translations of Thoth, claiming that the human mind could access divine truths directly. Rome applauded their scholarship publicly, but feared the implications privately. Knowledge that bypassed confession, that allowed a man to understand creation without papal mediation, was intolerable. It was not heresy in the conventional sense, but heresy in practice. To fear a scribe is to fear empowerment. This is why codices were redacted, why the Index Librorum Prohibitorum appeared in the year 1529, and why marginalia were so carefully monitored. The threat was never the devil's fire, it was the spark of understanding igniting inside a human mind. When an individual comprehends the laws of nature, the cosmos, and the self, they no longer need external authority to shape belief or action. They become priests of themselves. The scribe's power is subtle, almost invisible, but absolute in effect. Even today, the fear persists. Modern psychologists, coders, and researchers embody Thoth in new forms. Systems theory, artificial intelligence, and digital archives replicate the scribe's gift. People learn, map, and transmit patterns without waiting for permission. They decipher history, they trace lineages, they model the stars. Authority does not vanish entirely, but it shifts. Power moves from offices to minds, from altars to algorithms, and the Vatican watches closely, quietly regulating, quietly hiding, quietly fearing. In the end, the lesson is clear. Devils seduce, scribes illuminate. Temptation can be controlled through ritual, through warning, through fear. Knowledge, once transferred, cannot be contained. To fear Thoth is to fear liberation, the collapse of dependency, the empowerment of individuals to become their own interpreters of the sacred. The scribe does not punish. The scribe does not command. The scribe gives the keys to understanding and leaves the door open, and that is why Rome has always feared him more than any demon. You sit in a quiet reading room, the air thick with the scent of old parchment and ink, the kind of silence that makes every breath feel like a secret. Outside, the world rushes past with unseeing eyes, but here, time is measured differently. Here, the pages hold a weight far heavier than gold or relics, because they carry the proof that understanding can be its own authority. Across centuries, across empires, across churches and kingdoms, the real grail has never been a cup, a sword, or a crown. It has been the ability to measure truth inside yourself, to weigh your own heart against the cosmos and know what is real without asking permission. That is what Rome fears. That is what any Rome fears. The pen is simple, unassuming, yet it transforms. In Egypt, Thoth wrote not to command, but to record, to transmit, to illuminate. In the dim halls of medieval monasteries, scribes copied, annotated, and hid fragments of knowledge in the margins. The content did not simply inform, it empowered. When knowledge becomes portable, when a human can verify, compare, and reason, no hierarchy can contain it. A monk with a quill in 1350 could challenge centuries of dogma, not by rebellion, but by understanding. This is why authorities burn libraries, censor books, and index forbidden texts. The fear is not of heresy, as you might imagine, but of independence. Consider the Hermetic traditions that seeped into Europe, from Alexandria to Florence to Prague. Symbols, diagrams, letters, and formulas were more than decoration. They were tools for verifying what priests had long claimed only they could interpret. Each translation of a scroll, each careful study of geometry or alchemy, each whispered teaching that passed from master to student, created a new priesthood outside of Rome. Knowledge became a mirror, reflecting not the power of the church, but the capacity of the individual to understand, to measure, and to act. The pen weighs more than gold because it changes the weight of authority itself. Even in the modern age, this truth persists. Researchers digitize manuscripts, algorithms, map histories, and scholars cross-reference genealogies and star charts. The same ability to verify, to confirm, to reason continues. Authority becomes a choice rather than a mandate. The church may no longer burn books, but the anxiety remains. The pen can open worlds that palaces, vaults, and cathedrals cannot contain. It can replicate insight, and insight is a power no decree can revoke. So here, in this room of quiet light, you close a volume and realize the paradox. The Holy Grail is not external. It has never been. The Grail is within the mind of anyone willing to read, to question, to measure. Every scribe, every teacher, every pen across history has offered a chance to hold it. And that is why Rome has always feared the pen more than fire, more than armies, more than devils. Because the pen weighs your heart, and once it does, nothing can weigh it for you again.